Okay, I think that now we can start. Good morning, everyone. Present myself. I'm Davide Menozzi of the University of Parma. I'm an associate editor of Bio-Based and Applied Economics. That is the official journal of the Italian Association of Agriculture and Applied Economics. I'm very glad to welcome you to this third webinar of the 10th anniversary series. Actually, it was 2021 when both the journal and the association boards decided to launch this series of anniversary articles, actually review papers associated with these webinars, aiming at providing some state of the art of some relevant hot topics for the fields of agriculture and applied economics. So in the first of these webinars, it was January 2022. Alan Matthews provided some his contribution of the research to agricultural policy in Europe, and Jutta Rosen presented the effect of attribute framing on consumers' attitude and intention towards food. Then it was May 2022, we had the second webinar where Davide Viaggi talked about the bioeconomy in economic literature, and Francesco Mantino about the rural areas between locality and global networks. Today we will proceed with two more presentations that are published on the first issue of 2022 of Bio-Based and Applied Economics, but currently are still on the just accepted section of the website, and I will circulate in the chat the link to this section. So if you're interested, you can download these papers. I don't want to take much time to the speakers that are Domenico Dentoni, the first one, and Donato Romano, the second one. Domenico first. I briefly introduce Domenico, who is a full professor of business, resilience, and transformation at the Montpellier Business School. Both speakers have 20 minutes for presenting their work, and then we will have some time for question and answers. So, Domenico, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Davide, and thanks to the whole BAE community and to the journal, of course, for providing us this space for discussing some of our materials. So I will start from sharing my screen, and please let me know if it works.
Currently not, but I'm quite optimistic. It will do in a few seconds.
Something is moving?
Now it's working, yes.
Okay. So can you see my slide, my first slide for now?
Yes, of course.
Okay, excellent. So welcome everybody for this presentation, and what we would like to present to you is our paper that has been recently accepted by the journal. And as you can see, the title is Systems Thinking, Mapping and Change in Food and Agriculture. We are particularly happy that we had the chance of working through this paper with BAE, because of course, as the journal title says, bio-based and applied economics. What we really tried to do in this paper is to stretch the boundaries of the way we understand food and agriculture economics, to really understand the broader picture of what systems means, economic systems mean in this case in food and agriculture, as well as what it means to be applied. And so we are very proud that we were able to work through this with the journal. The idea of this paper comes from 8 years of practice, where we worked with a number of funding institutions, and 2 in particular that you see mentioned here, a Horizon project that we started last year, and before that, called Emphasis, this Horizon program called Emphasis, encouraging farmers towards resilient and sustainable systems change. And the other one is AIEAA project, entrepreneurial learning in inclusive agribusiness, funded by the Dutch Scientific Council. So these two projects in particular allowed us not just to apply this way of thinking and mapping and trying to accelerate and support change in food and agriculture, but actually to reflect upon that, upon our practices, and to actually write this paper. We have a long list of co-authors, so I'm not going to read them all, but by the end of this presentation, we will have the chance of having Rob and Ramin providing some thoughts. The pictures that you see here are coming from our different strands of practice. We have a couple of pictures, one from Malawi, where we have engaged in some of this systems work with farming communities, in particular dairy communities. Here we have a picture from Addis Abeba, where together with the USAID and some animal health scientists and veterinaries, as well as some scholars of my former university at Wageningen, we have engaged in some of these systems mapping. And here we have other two pictures of instances where we brought this way of thinking and mapping and trying to enact change in pedagogical settings. So what is this all about? The key question that we are posing ourselves, as you can see, is extremely general, right? Is how can we encourage actors in the agri-food sector to collectively understand their past and present problems and collectively envision a way to address them? You may say this is extremely broad question in the way we are used to pose research questions. At the same time, it's very relevant. I have no doubts that all of you see the importance of addressing this type of questions and find viable solutions given the status of our food and agricultural systems. So to address such a broad question, we have done a lot of work in the past decade, digging into intellectual roots that go beyond economics, but of course relate to economics. So we studied and we have worked with scholars that are grounded in engineering, into systems dynamics and its more qualitative applications in the past decades. We have dug into socio-ecological studies, where we include, the work on panarchy and its applications on qualitative and social ecological applications over time. The work of Donella Meadows on identifying leverage points. Of course, touching upon also the work of Elinor Ostrom on topics like polycentric governance. And of course, we are also building on social sciences through the work of seminal work of Van Bartalamfi that developed general system theories already starting from the 50s and rooted into a number of philosophies that, of course, now we do not have time to dig in, but it would be interesting too, of course. So based on these intellectual roots, we propose 3 definitions to understand what we are talking about. We are using systems thinking, which the general idea is understanding reality and try to enact change by understanding the dynamic interactions between ecological and the social agents in a system. We use it to propose an approach of systems mapping, which simply is a way of visually depicting a system, something that usually becomes very complex, and we have some other pictures later on, as a way to support meaningful systems change. And what do we mean with that? We mean societal changes that are that in order to address the problems that we face in food and agriculture are deep and broad enough to cut across some of the current power structures and cut across multiple sectors. Why we do that? We do that because we are particularly concerned at this stage that there is a whole stream of literature of people that actually we know, and we are, and we have a deep regard to, that are starting to use the language of food systems approaches that is quite fashionable nowadays, for what we consider a little bit of a replica of what has been in the past 20 years a value chain analysis, with a little bit more exposure of what happens around the food and agricultural chains. But we do not think that this way of approaching the language of systems is sufficiently deep to actually address the problems that we are urgently facing. Why so? When we look at pictures like this comes from some of our colleagues at Wageningen University, for example, Van Berkum and Borman and et al. These are large teams that are really like bringing these frameworks into a variety of projects and brilliant initiatives. What we see here is that this way of representing a food system does not really allow us, first of all, to understand what are the actors, so how actors can express and debate the problems that are entrenched within these systems. We also see the need of zooming into some of these problems, such as you can imagine, water and climate issues, biodiversity issues now are huge, and they really need to have much more of a zoom in to understand how they interconnect. And importantly, what we think is missing in current frameworks like this one on food systems approaches is a way of providing actors a way to reorganize in order to address problems within these systems. And so because of this current criticism on the way food systems approaches are used, we propose an alternative or a different entry point to address some of these problems. What do we propose in a few words? We propose a sort of a way of approaching systems mapping with participants in participatory settings, and we'll provide you later with some examples where we have engaged in participatory settings where we ask them to engage with two different maps. Okay, these two maps, usually in the language of systems mapping, are referred to causal loop diagrams. These are ways of taking any problem that we may have in food and agriculture. Let's say food security or food waste, and breaking it into its parts. Okay, so whether you can have food security, but then you can have as one of the variables number of people below the threshold of food security in a neighborhood, for example, or some elements on the nutritional values of food. And so the idea is that with participants in a participatory setting, you can break down a complex problem into its parts through a set of cause-effect relationships. Okay. What you can do at the same time, though, together with describing a problem in terms of causal loop diagrams, you can take the same problem and describing in terms of how actors are configured within that system. So this may look a little bit like a value chain, right? But beyond the value chain, you may also include the policymakers, the communities, and all the other actors that are around, the universities, of course, the other actors that are around the value chain, but also the interconnections among them in terms of resource flows. Okay, so basically what you get, and this idea, so the principle comes from Senge, that you can represent problems and you can represent actors as two sides of the same coin. Okay, this allows any participant, which by the way belongs to this system, okay, because you can invite to this participatory settings the actual actors that work within the value chain, for example, or students that are willing to enter into the value chain. You offer them a lens to represent where themselves are in that framework, into this system that they depict, and understand how their presence there is entrenched with the problems that they're living. Okay, so this is the mindset that we ask participants to approach this exercise. And once they do this in iterative ways, and we try to represent the iteration with these arrows, going back and forth, you can actually move from understanding problems to actually envisioning how they can do something to address those problems. What does it mean in practice? It means that in collective settings, and here, of course, the challenge is that sometimes they agree and sometimes they disagree. And also when they disagree, it's very healthy in a way, or is very generative according to participants, because they agree on what they disagree, which is particularly helpful, when actors are trying to address complex problems about where to intervene in the system. And when we use the language of where to intervene on the system, for those of you that are familiar with the work of Donella Meadows on systems thinking, she calls them leverage points. But by intertwining causal loop diagrams and value network maps, we become more concrete in a way of just identifying where we can address a specific problem, but we can also start thinking which type of coalition between different actors we can create, or which actors we may benefit to bring into our system in order to act upon such a leverage point. Of course, I'm rushing a lot through these things, and you may have many questions, and I'll be happy to take them, or my co-authors may be willing to add. So without going into this whole slide, we have attempted and sort of progressed over the years from 2013, working with USAID and in other settings around Wageningen University, of developing a procedure and optimize it as we were going along. You can see here the type of participants that we have been working with, and the list is continuing. We are quite excited to see that we are having more and more settings where we can apply this type of work. Just to give you a concrete example, because at this point, many of you may be still puzzled about what we are actually talking about. This is a pre-COVID picture, as you can imagine, where it was much easier, and perhaps a bit old-fashioned. We were still with flip charts and post-its. Now, most of this work has translated into online spaces, and we haven't really got back much to this. But this gives you a good sense of how in Addis Ababa, for example, some people working within and around the university and all the research institutes around the universities are discussing how some innovations that are important for the food and agricultural system can be actually enacted, given the current status of universities and research institutes in town. So here you can see them brainstorming, and here is another picture of another group brainstorming and connecting the dots as described. And you can see the outcomes are extremely messy, right? So there is no way I can summarize what they figure it out here. But what you can see interestingly here is that taking this approach allows the participants that are within that agri-food system to have a rapid brainstorm. This is the outcome of an exercise of 2-3 hours, to identify quickly where they think some of the nodes that do not allow the current system to really make some important changes. Well, of course, according to them, and prioritize their time and the resources on how to act on them. So this is one exit. This is the outcome of one map. And here's the other one. And interestingly, what they figured out is that according to their experience on the ground, really on the ground, they start thinking that, to really make some changes within the research and development ecosystem around Addis on issues like animal health, there needs to be some change happening within their university departments. So this is a powerful message, because we know how much it might be challenging to really make changes within a system to work through some of these mechanisms that often remain less visible within value chain analysis. So just to start to get into implications and to close, we think that there is a variety of systems mapping approaches, including the one that we are trying to propose and systematize and reflect upon, which allow participants to target multiple goals at the same time. And this is particularly important in an epochal phase where we are facing at the same time the risk of crisis. But at the same time, we need many of our enterprises need to continue making a profit, and at the same time, they need to retain workers and pay them enough. So these are multiple goals that we know are challenging to target at the same time. And the way we think that systems mapping and systems thinking can be tailored to think through this is that because, first of all, participants can prioritize where to intervene and where they can generate ripple effects that actually allow them to make an impact, a desirable impact in their space. It allows them, very importantly, to consider what could go wrong. In other words, what are the unintended consequences by brainstorming with other participants that they didn't know beforehand. It allows them to reflect on the bottlenecks, because often during these workshops or activities, they come up with brilliant ideas, but they soon realize that there are important bottlenecks such as bureaucracy, lack of trust, lack of funding, and they can identify where and if they can intervene on those. And by doing those, they can also prioritize which partnerships they can use in order to shift the system in a way that is meaningful to them. So this is just basically a conclusion of what I hope I was able to say. Going back to our question, how can we encourage actors to understand, collectively understand and envision envision problems and envision ways of addressing problems? Well, we think that our main point one is our main criticism. I don't think we do not think that we can truly address problems in agri-food if we don't understand the interconnected dynamics with other food systems, education, finance, policies, and so on. And so how can we zoom into those? We can do that by having tools that allow us to have participatory discussions to reorganize these networks. And here we are proposing a tool. And as I try to explain, we are combining two tools, causal loop diagrams and value network maps across two iterative phases. One that is sense making, more looking at the present and the past, and the other one connecting with the future, which is what we call envisioning. So this is it from my side. And Davide, you tell me, do we still have a minute for my co-authors to intervene?
Of course, yes.
Thank you. So I think I'll give the word to Rob first. I cannot see you guys, but I think you're there. Rob and then Ramin, if you can be.
Yes,
yeah.
I'm here. Thank you, Domenico. I assume everyone can hear me. So thank you for this presentation. I think one thing that I might want to add, we talked about prioritization and what kind of intervention they want to do. And I think one major advantage of this approach is that participants also become more aware and deliberately choose what they will not do. And especially with complex problems, and especially when students are in this kind of creative mode, we tend to want to do too much. And I think one major advantage of the approach we have is that people become more aware also about deliberate decisions. What will we not do and why? And with this, I think, yeah, I can also leave some space for Ramin because we're short on time, I think.
Just to thank you. Thanks, Rob, and thank you, Domenico, and thanks for being here. I appreciate it. I think one thought that comes to my mind with all of this, and one thing to emphasize, is just the power of boundary objects and objects like that can create shared meaning. And that's not to say that the mapping is the solution. It's that it is the first step. That through it you can see where to intervene. You can have the same language. You can use that as kind of a way to navigate and change your map. And I think that's where I don't want to speak on behalf of my co-authors, but we come from this in a kind of a posture of learning. So we've learned there's a lot of dynamics involved. So we've mapped some of them, mapping, but as well as there's a lot to learn in a lot of different avenues. There's the power of the map itself, the power of the process, the power of just being able to point out interventions. And so there's a lot more there. And I think what we've enjoyed is just kind of delving into the topic a bit. And thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Domenico. Thank you, Rob and Ramin, for your interventions. Actually, very interesting and inspiring. We can keep the questions at the end eventually. So I have already some, but of course, I hope the audience will have other points to address. And now it's the turn of the second speaker, who is Donato Romano. Sorry, Donato is has been president of the Italian Association of Agriculture and Applied Economics, is currently member of the European Association of Agricultural Economists, and today he will present a paper he has written with Pierluigi Montalbano about vulnerability and resilience to food and nutrition insecurity. So this is a more specific argument, but strictly linked to the, let's say, complex problems that Domenico just addressed with this model. Donato, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks very much, Davide, and thanks you all for being here this afternoon. Can you see my screen? Oops.
Yes.
It should be there. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, as Davide already said, this is a joint effort with made with Pierluigi Montalbano, who is professor of development economics at the Sapienza University in Rome. Now, let me just start trying to provide some background information. And oops, I do not know why this not. No, it's moving. Okay. Why we decided to focus on vulnerability and resilience? There are both practical and conceptual reasons, I should say. I think it is everyone's experience that we are living in a world where we are experiencing increasing shocks and risks and a lot of uncertainty. I mean, shocks and risk of many nature, being them economic or natural or of different sources, health risks, etc. And this is something that brought about, I would say, quite an important change in the way development agencies were thinking about their own interventions. I listed here just two of the most important steps that was made by the development and humanitarian community that brought about more recently to what the World Bank and the United Nations system called the new way of working, which was focusing on the so-called human development and peace nexus, which means actually that we cannot seriously talk about development if we do not have also in mind some intervention for emergency and vice versa. And so we have to address at the same time both dimensions that traditionally have been divided. But there are also some conceptual reasons, because I think that if we ask lay people and also some scholars, the two concepts, vulnerability and resilience, are quite similar. And I would say they are also largely overlapping, as I will show in a minute. But the problem is that, at least so far, at best on our knowledge, there is no comprehensive comparative analysis of vulnerability and resilience. And when I say comparative analysis between the two concepts, I am also referring to the fact that we should look at the many different definitions for vulnerability on one side and resilience on the other side of being provided by economists. Not mentioning, for instance, other fields. And if we have many different definitions, of course, we could expect that we have different models, different at least theoretical framework, conceptual framework that behind it, and a different measurement that you can use. This is just those are just a couple of very general definition of vulnerability and resilience, and I have highlighted here in bold some of the things that are the building blocks of the two definitions that are more or less, I would say, in the common sense, I repeat, felt, perceived as the same. In one case, the stress is on risk. In the other case, it is on stressors and shocks. In one case, those definitions focus on option available and ability to handle risks. And in the other case, it is on the capacity of dealing with those risks and shocks. And finally, in one case, it is emphasized this ability to make a living, or in the other case, it is to prevent long-lasting adverse development consequences. And probably this last one is the only one that is a little bit more different. There is not, I would say, almost a complete overlapping between the two dyads as we saw before. And I will come back to this towards the end of my intervention in order to show where the difference lies. So at the end of the day, the problem is that also in the public discourse, this issue of comparing vulnerability and resilience is a problem, has been a problem. This is just the first page of the web edition of The Guardian that says the resilience, meaningless jargon or development solution. So it seems that resilience, more than vulnerability, but also vulnerability, especially resilience, has become a sort of buzzword that have been used in many contexts. And just discovered that also Domenico title is Professor of Business Resilience and Transformation. So there should be good reasons for having a course that is focusing on that. So basically, what we'd like to address is a very general question. So is the resilience different from vulnerability? And if so, in what respects? And this has been addressed focusing on three different levels. First, looking at the different conceptualizations of the two concepts. Second, of the metrics that can be used in order to measure this concept. And finally, looking at what are the possible policy implications of using this concept. And here I would emphasize two main implications that are referring that are of practical use for economists.
We have 6 people total.
Sorry. Okay, targeting and impact evaluation. With important caveats from the very beginning that we would like to emphasize and to make our analysis from the specific viewpoint of food and nutrition insecurity. Okay, so to begin with, I will start with something that is quite well known. It is the definition of food security, but I'm recalling that because this is very important in order to derive a few axioms that are important in order to identify, I would say, metrics for measuring food and nutrition insecurity. And then I move in the central part of my presentation to the two concepts. First, providing the different or alternative definitions also within each of those two boxes and the measurement approaches. Actually, I will just swiftly mention measurement approaches. If you're interested, please refer to the paper on BAE. And finally, we will try to provide a unifying framework. This is not completely original from our side, but I think that it is original the way we put the two things together and the comprehensiveness of the analysis that we have carried out. To conclude with a few research and policy implications. So here we have the standard definition of food security, okay, provided by the World Food Summit in 1996. Now, if you look at what has been underlined in this definition, we can derive at least 4 different axioms that are important in order to have a meaningful metrics to measure food and nutrition security. First is the so-called scale axiom. The scale axiom simply means that a good measure, a good metrics should be able to address both individual and groups at any scales of aggregation, including geographic regions or political jurisdiction. This is what is referring to all people in the definition. The second one, the time axioms, is referring to the all times over there, which means that here we are interested in something that should look at the evolution over time, at the dynamics of the phenomenon over time, and specifically we will see why it is important that those measures should be forward-looking. And this is specifically referring to the so-called stability definition, dimension of this definition. Access here is referring to a different level, being them individual or collective organisms, to capture this access dimension. Here is referred to with the word physical, social, and economic access, and possibly this encompasses also the availability definition that is behind the concept of food security. And last but not least, an outcome axioms that refer to the well-being dimension. And here, simply, we would like to emphasize that this is related to utilization dimension of food security. And in this definition, it is immediately linked to this emphasis on an active and healthy life. So this means that we are interested not in food consumption per se, but as a tool in order to let people to gain their own well-being at a nutrition and health level. Okay, now let me start with the vulnerability measures. I think that after some 20 years or so of discussion within the especially development economics field, we can group the different approaches that has been presented in 3 different classes. The first one is vulnerability to expected poverty. The second one is vulnerability as a low expected utility. And the third one is a vulnerability as the threat of future poverty. I would like to emphasize to begin with that in all those definitions, the focus is on poverty. There is no explicit reference to food security. Now, let me very quickly to start with the first definition, vulnerability to expected poverty over here. This definition, that is also the first one that has been proposed in the literature, simply state that vulnerability is the probability that the household level of consumption at a given time, t+1 in the future, will be below the consumption poverty line Z, okay? And you can see over here in the equation over there that this is conditioned to a series of different observable variables indicated by the vector X over there. Now, if we match this definition with the 4 axioms that have been mentioned before, what you can see here is that some of them are met, some others are not. The most important ones, I should say, is the assumption, the very heroic assumption that this definition makes, that is that the variability that you have in cross-section is a good predictor of the variability that you would expect in time series, which is actually very well known this not the case. So this is the most important limitation of this this definition. In order to try to overcome with this problem, Ligon and Schechter proposed a second definition that is the vulnerability to expected utility. Actually, using the standard framework that we have in risk analysis, those authors proposes that the difference between the utility derived from the sole level of a certain equivalent consumption at and above a certain level the household is consuming if those households are above this level, well, they will be not considered vulnerable, and you compare this with the actual consumption, the actual utility they can derive from consuming a certain level of food. I just reported the very end of the process. You can see that according to this definition, you can also decompose vulnerability according to what is related to structural factors. It is the first line over there, which means that it is related to poverty. The second, the third line over there is referring to covariant risks, either at national or regional level and at meso level. And finally, you have something that is referring to idiosyncratic risks. Despite the fact that this is clearly an advance as compared to the previous case, it still has some limitation. The first one is that there is no focus axiom. In poverty literature, poverty analysis literature, focus axioms refers to the fact that any change that happens above the poverty line should not change the perception of poverty, or in this case of vulnerability, which is not the case with this formalization, with this conceptualization. The other thing that is quite important here is that the mean consumption is perceived here as independent from risk, which underestimate actually the overall effect of risk. Then you can have also a set of other problems here that are referring, for instance, to the implications of using different functional forms, or the fact that this is measured in utils, because here we're talking about utility, difference in utility that are very difficult to be translated in policy measures, etc., etc., etc. So this is why Durkan and Calvin-Durkan propose this third approach, that is the vulnerability as a threat to poverty, which takes into account the burden that is caused by this threat of poverty. So the very fact that somebody is being exposed to some likely state of nature that are downside risk in the future, well, this may have some implications in terms of some preventative change in the behavior of those people. So this already, I mean, even though the shock will not materialize in the future, there are some implications that you have still already today. Here, again, this is probably the most advanced way to think and to conceptualize the vulnerability, but at the same time, this also has some limitations. The first one is the fact that in order to compute this measure, you need to know everything, I would say, on the many different states of nature that the future can bring. So what is required here are very long panel data, very good data sets, and very much informative on all the possible states of nature of all the people that are involved, and observable characteristics of those data. So this is quite data demanding. But from the conceptual viewpoint, what is important is that the scale axiom here is not met, because it is very difficult to aggregate different across different individuals, across different households or communities, etc., etc. Okay, now let's move to the resilience. In the resilience literature as well, we have different approaches. I listed here at least 4 different approaches, and I will be focusing on the first 3, while I'm not talking about resilience as transformability, which is probably the closest concept of resilience to what Domenico talked about having a system approach to the analysis of those problems. So I will focus on the first one, that is resilience as a capacity that has been developed by FAO. The second one, that is resilience as a return to equilibrium, that is something that is quite close to, I would say, an engineering viewpoint of resilience. And finally, I will focus on resilience as a normative condition. That is the way development economists usually look at resilience. It has been recently proposed by Cissé and Barrett in Journal Development Economics 2018. I would say here that when we talk about resilience, differently from the previous case, those concepts refer to both poverty and food insecurity. So let me start with the first one. As I said, the FAO approach, it is called the RIMA approach, is looking at resilience as a capacity to absorb and to limit the adverse effect of exposure to some shocks and stressors in the near and the longer time. You can see over here that the resilience capacity index is a function of, is a latent variable because cannot be observed, is something that can be measured in a two-step framework. First, moving from some observable characteristics that can be aggregated as latent variables in what the FAO call the pillars that are reported over here as ABS, that stands for access to basic services, assets, social safety nets, adaptive capacity, etc., etc. At the same time, this resilience capacity index is estimated also with reference to some outcomes. The typical case in FAO is to have either a quantitative or a qualitative or both a measure of food security. And this is done using the so-called multiple indicators, multiple causes model. Now, what are the problems with this measure? Well, first of all, it is a capacity, so it is an explanatory variable rather than an outcome. And this might be a problem, especially if we are serious when we talk about the use that this resilience calculus has been done by the practitioners. So many policymakers are looking for interventions that are able to increase resilience of households or communities or individuals or states, right? And if it is an explanatory variable, actually we cannot measure the impact of a specific interventions on this resilience as an outcome. The second thing is that it is not forward-looking. I mean, this is something that initially, but also today, can be applied simply in a static, in a cross-section context. And even more importantly, when we talk about development, it is not anchored to any norm. Okay, so actually, this is an index that is that has no unit of measure, and it is not anchored to a specific scale. So we do not know. We know that more is better, but we do not know how much is better if we compare to different contexts. The second approach is resilience as a return to equilibrium. As I already told you, this is basically the measurement of the speed of recovery of an individual or a household after the shock hits that individual. Okay, what's the problem in this definition? First, it cannot be decomposed or aggregate across a subpopulation. So this is why it does not meet the scale axiom. And also, again, probably the major limitation is represented by the fact that having as a reference the status quo ante the shock, what happens is that no importance whatsoever has been given to the level of the starting level, in the sense that if you imagine that you have a poor guy, so somebody who is already below the poverty line or somebody who is already food insecure, simply measuring the speed of coming back to the previous status does not mean that you have improved the situation of this guy. You are simply measuring how far he can come back to a negative, in quotation marks, a negative status because this guy is poor or is a food insecure. Okay, and this point at what is really important in development economics, the very fact that when we talk about resilience, we have to anchor it to a scale, and it should be anchored to a normative condition. This is exactly what has been done by the so-called development resilience proposed by Sisson and Barrett. So, and this is done through a three steps approach. First, the authors measure the conditional mean that is household specific of a given outcome. Here, W could be either poverty or food security, whatever, an indicator of those outcome. In the second step, using the residuals of the first estimation, then you can compute the specific conditional variance of that individual. And finally, having knowing the first and the second moment, we can use any two parameter distribution, being it normal or gamma or whatever. We can compute this row that represents a score, which simply tells us how much is the probability that the indicator we are chosen for that specific individual I in the future will be above a certain norm, a certain threshold, according to the vector of characteristic of this individual and the shocks he has been exposed. And here you can see that in this case, the way this resilience has been derived make it possible to meet the scale axiom, the time axiom, the access, and the outcome axiom. Okay, so coming back to our definition of vulnerability and resilience, what is important here is that it seems that resilience, different from vulnerability, is specifically looking at the long-lasting adverse development consequences. So putting even more clearly, when we talk about vulnerability, this is a forward-looking concept, but simply, it measures how much is the probability that at any point in the future, this individual will go below a certain threshold, being it a poverty line or a food insecurity a minimum, okay, or food intake a minimum. In the case of resilience, what we are interested is in the realization along all the times, the periods that we have in the future, and we would like to emphasize if there are long-lasting consequences. Putting in this way, it is clear that the resilience is something that is very close to the concept of poverty trap, because in this case, we would like to emphasize that if the shock is strong enough and given the characteristics of the context and of that specific individual, then it can be trapped in a low level equilibrium, and it will be not able to bounce back to either previous or, even more importantly, to I would say a better condition. In order to understand why it is like that, which is something that simply emphasizes that you remember the first question that I raised, is resilience just a flip side of vulnerability? Our answer it is not. And it is not, which also means that we are giving a significance for the policy use of this concept. In order to explain why, let me just show you something with an example. This is
Donato, you should conclude.
I conclude very quickly. So you can see that from in two cases, you can have that when you are zero vulnerability, of course, you are resilient. And when you are not resilient, of course, you are vulnerable. But there are some cases where you have that vulnerability and resilience. I mean, you can have somebody that can be both vulnerable, and in this case, you can see that this household is going below the asset poverty line, but then it can bounce back. Okay. If we look at what happens in the poverty trap literature, and the ones that are familiar with this can see over here that it is this swinging up and down blue line across this 45 degrees straight line over here. Well, you can see that although you can have a transition, a distribution, conditional transition, and you on average are in the food and nutrition security area, there is some probability that is non-zero that you can be brought down a certain threshold. So even for the ones that on average will be food secure, in the other case, they in some specific cases they can be vulnerable. Okay, now just let me conclude, and because I'm taking too much time. Our way to look at it is the following. If you look at the vulnerability literature, the emphasis is on, I would say, the second moment of the distribution. So they put a lot of emphasis on the risk and the consequences of risk. But in doing that, I mean, the standard vulnerability literature does not pay attention to nonlinearity of the dynamics. Vice versa, if we look at the poverty traps literature, they do exactly opposite. So they look at the nonlinearity because they are focusing on the first moment, and they take into account this nonlinear behavior in the future. Actually, resilience, as it has been conceptualized by Barrett and colleagues, put together these two literature, including both the first and second moment, so both nonlinearity as the poverty trap literature does, and the second moment, so the conditional moments as the vulnerability literature does. So in our opinion, resilience is the concept that must be used if we are serious in measuring and providing some policy implications for addressing food and nutrition insecurity. I will stop there, and sorry for being too long. Over to you.
No, thank you. Thank you very much, Donato. It was really, really very interesting. I didn't want to interrupt you because it was a very interesting, comprehensive, your presentation. But of course, now I'm leaving the floor also to the audience. If there are some questions for Domenico or Donato about their speech and presentations, you're welcome. You can intervene either raising the hand or providing the question on the chat if you prefer.
Well, I would like to make a question to Domenico. Here is Mario Roccaro from EIT Food. Domenico, nice to meet you, and very nice, Donato and Davide, to pull this very interesting discussion. Well, discussion now, but very nice knowledge transfer. Domenico, I mean, when we look at the food systems, it is so complex that when you talk about actors and when you do system thinking, as you present it, it's very difficult to understand whether what comes out is for a very, very tiny problem or it's the complete complexity of the value chain, if you like. Okay, so do you think it's possible to dissect piece and bit and then put them together, or you need to treat system thinking in a way that is always so systemic? Because even a small enterprise is a system per se, okay? Or if you like, an enterprise which is dealing with water scarcity is a system per se. What is your view about that? Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot,
Davide. May I just jump in on that specifically?
Please,
Yeah, sure.
Sorry. Yeah.
Yes.
No, actually, this was a very good point, because I was about to raise the same question about how do you change your own approach according to different scales, and the problem of nesting, okay, subsystems within systems. But this is the first question. The second one I would like to ask you is that my own experience with these approaches is that, of course, here we are using qualitative methods specifically. So one of the issues that we have there is that we have a very low external validity. We can learn, but very hardly we can generalize. This is the trade-off that usually we have, between quantitative versus qualitative approaches. I'm just curious to see if you have thought about that, and if there is any way to try to contribute on this as well. Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks. Well, thank you so much. Got two questions. One, indeed, they are very much related. So thanks also to Donato for jumping in. The question is brilliant, in my view, because in fact, it really depends on how we are looking at systems mapping as a way of representing and really acting with participants in relation to a problem. Because when we are talking about systems, as you are hinting on, just for the rest of our audience, we are talking about an entire set of interconnections that cut across scales, right? So we can look, our body is a system already, right? And our family is a system, our community or organizations are systems, our municipalities, so on, our country, the whole world, and so on. So that means, and these are all interconnected. So the question that always arises, and thanks Mario and Donato for pointing it so clearly, is well, how do we make sense of this, right? Because the exercise can go on forever. Okay, so there are two limits, very concrete limits to this. The first limit is who and how you can bring people on board, okay, within a common space. So if you do it in physical space, you can bring 80 to 100 maximum. If you do it online, you can go to 200 and so on. Still, you need to be careful. In countries like, in some countries where we work, we cannot bring any stakeholder together and to try to understand different parts of the systems. There could be situations where that can lead to tensions, very serious tensions. So you cannot do that. So how do you act in these situations, and what are the boundaries of their work, right? So this is my reframing of the question, because we address this. So first of all, I would say one key is looking at systems mapping as a process, possibly interconnected process between different spaces where this type of exercise takes place. So for example, Mario, if we are interested in understanding issues within and around the company, one solution could be to do one of these exercises within the company with different teams within it. But then if the company itself relates, starts discussing their set of problems and refer to something that is going on, for example, with a municipality or with another company or with a set of other, a social movement and so on, some issues there, then you can organize different sessions and iterate between those to get to a more complex understanding. The issue that, in fact, Donato, you are asking a similar question in relation to scales, right? So what we have done with some companies, for example, take Veolia in France that is dealing with water. Okay, so we discussed some of these issues within the company with some stakeholders near the company, but then we brought the same discussion at a broader scale within the department. Okay, and then of course when you expand and you take societal stakeholders that to some extent provide views at the department scale beyond the company where it operates, you start seeing very different perspectives. And the interesting part is indeed iterating as part of a process so that you can get a more complex understanding of this. Any of these solutions, any of this way of iterating between different settings to create a more of a decentralized way of going for systems mapping do not address the second point that Donato just pointed out, which is generalizability and external validity. So Donato, I know exactly what you mean with that. Coming, with a PhD in agricultural economics, and so the whole work that is being done here with stakeholders is basically a local understanding, is an in-depth local understanding of the lived experiences of the participants. So while the outcomes of the maps, of this way of thinking, it's not generalizable at all. It's local, it's extremely local, is really around these participants. What can be generalized to some extent is the approach of triggering a way for them to participate and bringing bringing their ideas and build a shared common understanding. I will pause it here. I see Rob has a raised hand, and please.
Yeah, so one thing that I want to add to what you've been saying, Domenico, in the picture you also saw it's an iterative process also between the envisioning and sense making. So what happens often, especially in student settings, is they have a quite general higher level mapping of the causes and consequences of a complex problem. Could be over tourism in Amsterdam, let's say. Or it could be carbon footprint of a food system in the city, and then they come with some interventions that are still quite general. So it could be we have to reduce pre-consumption food waste, let's say, and then often that's where they see that's where you can make the biggest impact, for example, and then that's where we often push in. Okay, so if this is the intervention, we might assume other people came up with the idea. Why is it not there yet, right? So what are the things that makes it hard to get to these kind of interventions? And often that relates to the complex problem in which they want to intervene. So you see that once they start to think of a direction where they want to go, they will deepen out that particular part of the problem. So the process itself is actually also a matter of zooming in and zooming out. So the advantage of this is that at one point they know in a lot of detail the specific problem that they're tagging into and the intervention that they will do, and at the same time still being able to zoom out and see where in the bigger picture actually that comes in and what might be some of those bigger picture patterns that ultimately might have an effect or might act as a bottleneck. So it's not that they will picture everything in extreme detail, but it's based from the abstract that you zoom in and out and make well-informed decisions what not to do and what to prioritize. So this iteration is a crucial part of the process.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Davide, please. Davide Viaggi.
Yes, good afternoon, and thank you very much for your presentations. I actually had a question in the back of my mind that maybe goes a bit beyond your very interesting presentations. I mean, many of these topics actually are framed in on the one hand, sometimes the contrast between qualitative and quantitative approaches, and on the other hand, for example, I have in mind examples. I'm not an expert, of course, of development, but I have in mind many examples related to vulnerability and resilience with very sophisticated theoretical concepts and then narrow down to using the few data they have that in fact change interpretation of things that we know already with a different name. I wonder if you think we may expect any game changer event coming from digitalization and data world, let's say. I mean, new sources of information, more systematic quantitative insights about behavior. For example, when I think of system thinking, I mean, in systems where we for some reason have very detailed information on the connection, sometimes we have probably quite a lot of insights coming from quantitative analysis of networks, for example, that can give additional things. I mean, can we expect in something changing sharply the applicability and the interpretation of these methods? The question is for both, actually.
So probably Donato can start here, if you wish.
No, it is true. It is true that you know, usually people think of this opposition, you know, qualitative versus qualitative, and the trade-off is what we were saying. You know, from one side you have a quite strong, I would say, I'm not talking about internal validity, but external validity versus in-depth analysis, as Domenico and Rob were emphasizing. And usually we we end up with something that both methods are needed, right? And we never do it because we will go to different directions. I think that this is something that actually cannot be solved at all. Working in development countries, it happened to me to use some of this system thinking, you know, in everyday life when you work with people. And here the key word is doing something that is participatory in order to let the people express themselves without that, I mean, instead of superimposing something that is completely alien, okay, being them something that comes from scholarly your knowledge, or simply what you think is important or not. In this case, David, I think that my experience brings to me to say that those approaches Domenico was emphasizing are especially good in positive terms, using our own language, right? And to analyze and to let emerge what are the issues. But I have also to say that those are also important when you would like to emphasize what could be possible way out. Okay, solution to those issues. Where is the problem? The problem is that no matter how good this is in that specific case, at the end of the day, there is no conceptual framework, okay, no received wisdom about those things, and we can also live without that, of course. But anyway, the problem is that, not the problem, I mean, the observation that I can have there is that you simply give up. You do not refer to those things at all. Okay, once you have gone through the right steps, Domenico emphasized that what is important is the procedure. And when you have behaved, I would say, correctly, in this procedure, what is important at the end of the day is that not to measure a given outcome, as I try to explain in my own paper, right? You need to have an outcome that is normatively established, and then to measure that, and then you see what could be the consequence of a given intervention. The way you do those things is that you design an intervention that is supposed to solve an issue. Then you have a result framework. So you measure and monitor what's going on, and then you measure the progress towards that, period. This is something that you can do everywhere. Now, can you use this amendment to expect that there will be positive implications when you look at new technologies? Well, coming to what I talked about, I don't expect that this is the case, not yet at least. We are still at the stage where we are experimenting how good are different and competing approaches and what we can learn. At least we try to take advantage of the fact that it is rooted within a certain theoretical framework, and then if we do, for instance, impact analysis of what could be the possible determinants of a given outcome or what could be the consequences of a given intervention, we will try to generalize. But at the moment, I would say that the overall results is quite disappointing. First, because alternative measurement of how good they are different measures, different metrics, simply shows that out of the sample prediction, because this is what is important when we look at targeting, when you look at the resilience or vulnerability. So identifying who will be vulnerable in the future, who will be resilient in the future, etc., etc. I'm saying that all those approaches are very poor out of the sampling prediction capacity. Okay, so I don't think that we are still there. So putting it in a different way, in a very bloody way, simply use what is the very last measure of that outcome, I mean 1 year before, and try to carry out, and this will outbeat, at least so far, this is the very last paper that I read, it is something that is better than the other one. And the second thing is that, David, I think that you were hinting to the fact that we can build a very nice conceptual construction of this, but then at the end of the day, the problem is that I really need, to have all this data I mean, to have this effort, such a complex construction, when actually I need to operate in an environment where I do not have very good data, very detailed data and very large data set? My answer is, of course, you don't. And this is especially true if you are in a situation when you are trying to recover after the shock, okay? So those things that I've been talking about is important because we want to learn something in the hope that in the future you can point at some subsets of variables that can be used in order to make this monitoring, especially for early warning issues. Sorry for being too long, but over to you, Domenico.
Thanks, Donato. Definitely passionate topic and points. Really, I mean, I think that the point that Donato made on basically the different entry points, but also the complementarity between qualitative and quantitative ways of understanding, in a way, change and impact in relation to these ways of approaching, an empirical setting. Is very interesting, and I fully agree in a way. In fact, one aspect to consider is that the way we understand the field of impact assessment, okay, as we see it, for example, currently in large agricultural programs around sub-Saharan Africa, is to combine a qualitative part, which is very open. The interesting thing is that it's not just about the qualitative aspect, but it's the inductive component of it. Okay, that means that you do not start with an actual aspect that you are measuring or seeking to fulfill a certain measure, but you actually see more broadly what is going on. Okay, and then when you return to the field, from the baseline to the change that you are trying to observe, you are also trying to understand after a few years what is now going on with a few years of distance. Okay, so he's basically like casting a very broad net and trying to observe the whole, which with all its complexities, of course, right? And that's where these qualitative methods play a role, but of course, depending on the intentions of the agency, of the participants, of who is doing the assessment, it might be extremely valuable at the same time to have specific measures built on decades, if not centuries, of wisdom on how those measures are. And the example that Donato provided with resilience and vulnerability are important measures that can be used, for example, in impact assessment, as well as in a variety of different ways. So while we cannot reconceive these two ways of observing things, because they have like different epistemologies behind that, we can combine them. And in fact, as far as I know, many impact assessment programs, they are combining them. And that's an excellent way to proceed, in my view. On digitalization, there are many thoughts that I could provide in relation to what I was discussing of system mapping, and in particular to the latest trends of this digitalization, thinking about artificial intelligence and so on. It's a very open question, and in fact, everybody is debating it nowadays. Artificial intelligence, I think one of the challenges of artificial intelligence or interesting conversations that we can have is how local the knowledge that the machines acquire can be, how much grounded it can be on the lived experiences of those that are living problems. Okay, so in a way, can we imagine a machine that can really learn, empathize with those that are living problems in place? For sure we can, but that needs to be a very intelligent type of machine. So until there, I think there is a space for human beings to engage in this type of work, to understand complex problems as in between humans, of course, using machines as tools, as mediators to sharing our wisdom and try to find common solutions. Short answer on this aspect on what could be a whole debate in itself, of course. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Domenico. Thank you, Donato. I think we are running a bit late, but if we have a last quick question, otherwise we can stop the webinar here. I think, yeah, we had, I think, a great discussion so far, and thank you very much, Domenico. Thanks a lot, Donato, for your presentations. Very inspiring, very comprehensive. And of course, if you're interested in getting more in details, you can, of course, read the papers and contact the authors, and they are, of course, they will be very happy to interact with you for further